The fields of Cannae ran red with Roman blood. In a single day, Hannibal of Carthage shattered an army once thought invincible, slaying tens of thousands and plunging Rome into despair. Senators lay dead, legions annihilated, and the eternal city trembled on the edge of annihilation. Yet from this abyss of terror and ruin, a new kind of strength would rise, one forged not in triumph, but in survival. This is the story of how Rome endured Hannibal's fury and turned disaster into destiny. Stay with us as we journey through fire and blood, from Rome's darkest hour at Cannae to its rebirth at Zama. Witness the clash of titans, the rise of new leaders, and the turning of fate itself. Like, subscribe, and join Rome's struggle for survival. The summer sun blazed mercilessly over the fields of Apulia in 216 BC. Dust swirled, carrying with it the cries of thousands, and the earth itself seemed to shudder beneath the weight of slaughter. On that cursed day at Cannae, Rome's legions, nearly 80,000 strong, marched with confidence, their banners high, their eagles gleaming in the light. They believed they were about to crush Hannibal once and for all, to avenge humiliations suffered in the years past. Instead, they were walking straight into a trap that history would remember as one of the greatest disasters ever inflicted upon a Roman army. Hannibal, the Carthaginian genius who had led his men and war elephants across the icy Alps, had chosen his ground carefully. With deceptive brilliance, he placed his weaker infantry at the center, knowing the Romans, proud and reckless, would hurl themselves against it. As the Roman host pressed forward, the Carthaginian line bent inward, like a bowstring pulled taut. The Romans, believing victory was at hand, surged deeper, blind to the jaws closing around them. Then came the snap of the trap. Carthaginian cavalry under Hannibal struck from behind, while Hannibal's infantry curled around the Roman flanks. In moments, Rome's legions were no longer advancing. They were encircled, trapped in a tightening ring of steel. What began as a battle turned into a massacre. The press of men was so suffocating that Romans could not lift their swords to strike. Soldiers clawed for air, crushed by their comrades, cut down by Carthaginian blades. Blood soaked the soil, and the Tiber's distant waters seemed to echo with the screams of the dying. Some men fell to their knees, calling upon the gods. Others fought like trapped animals, hacking wildly, only to collapse beneath the endless tide of death. By sunset, the proud legions of Rome lay broken. Nearly 50,000 Romans were slain, consuls, senators, noblemen, common soldiers alike. It was not simply an army that perished that day, but the very pride of the Republic. 1/3 of the Senate lay among the dead, their bodies stripped and trampled, their names forever scarred into Rome's memory as victims of Hannibal's genius. News of the catastrophe swept back to the Eternal City with the swiftness of a plague. Rome had suffered defeats before, at the Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, but nothing compared to the horror of Cannae. This was annihilation, pure and absolute. The streets filled with wails as mothers, wives, and children learned of sons, husbands, and fathers who would never return. The Forum, once a place of oratory and order, became an open graveyard of grief. Panic gripped the city. The people whispered that Hannibal would march upon Rome itself, that Carthaginian elephants would soon thunder through the gates of the capital. Some urged surrender, believing the gods had abandoned them. Others demanded reckless vengeance, calling for new armies to be raised, even if it meant arming slaves and criminals. But despair weighed heavier than resolve. Cannae was more than a battle lost. It was Rome's soul torn open. Never before had the Republic faced such utter devastation on its own soil. The vision of Hannibal, the Punic specter, who had outwitted every Roman general, loomed larger than life. He was no longer just an enemy commander. He was a phantom of dread, a nightmare that stalked the heart of Rome. In the Senate, silence reigned as messengers listed the dead. Each name was a dagger. Fathers who had once sent sons to war now found themselves bereft. Statesmen who had spoken proudly of Rome's invincibility now hung their heads in disbelief. The Republic had been struck at its very core, and the question that haunted every mind was brutal in its simplicity. Could Rome survive? Cannae was not merely a military defeat, it was a reckoning. The arrogance of Rome, The belief that sheer numbers and iron discipline would always triumph had been shattered. The gods, it seemed, had favored Carthage, and Hannibal had become the instrument of divine wrath. For the first time in centuries, the eternal city trembled, not as conqueror, but as prey. And yet, amidst the ruins of that terrible day, the seed of Rome's resilience began to stir. For though Hannibal had shattered their armies, though the fields of Apulia lay red with their lifeblood, the people of Rome were not yet willing to lay down their arms. In their grief, in their terror, a question burned quietly, waiting for an answer. Who would rise to guide Rome from the abyss? Out of the ashes of Cannae, Rome searched desperately for salvation. The Republic had lost its armies, its sons, its pride. Senators grieved, the people cried out, and yet Hannibal still roamed the Italian countryside, undefeated and unchallenged. In such a moment, the people longed for a savior, a man who could lift the weight of despair and give them reason to hope. What they found was not a lion charging into battle, but a patient figure, quiet, steadfast, and unyielding, Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucosus. He was not young nor dazzling in charisma. His enemies mocked him for his caution, his deliberate slowness, and even his nickname, Cunctator, the delayer, was meant at first as ridicule. Yet in the silence of catastrophe, when all other voices clamored for vengeance or surrender, it was Fabius who spoke with calm clarity. He told the Roman people that their salvation would not come from another pitched battle against Hannibal. To fight him on his terms was to march willingly into the jaws of death. Rome, he said, must learn patience, restraint, and endurance, virtues that felt alien to a people bred on conquest. The Senate, desperate and divided, entrusted him with the title of dictator, an ancient office revived only in moments of dire crisis. With that authority, Fabius forged a strategy unlike any Rome had seen before. He would not meet Hannibal in open battle. He would shadow him, harass his foragers, cut his supply lines, and slowly grind him down. Like a wolf circling a lion, he would weaken Hannibal by denying him the feast of Roman blood he craved. To many Romans, this was heresy. Their ancestors had conquered Italy, humbled kings, and defied the Gauls not by retreat, but by courage in battle. The Roman identity was inseparable from the clash of legions and the glory of decisive victory. Yet Fabius dared to tell his people that survival was greater than pride, that patience was stronger than recklessness. For this, he was scorned. Soldiers grumbled that their commander was a coward. Senators whispered that he sought to prolong the war to enrich his own power. Even among the common people, the hunger for vengeance burned hotter than the wisdom of caution. But Fabius was unmoved. He knew that every Roman army lost in battle only fed Hannibal's legend, while every Roman life preserved gave the Republic another chance to endure. So he shadowed Hannibal relentlessly. When the Carthaginian general marched, Fabius followed. When Hannibal pillaged Italian fields, Fabius struck at his raiders. When Hannibal sought to lure him into battle with mockery and destruction, Fabius remained stone-faced, refusing to be baited. Hannibal, accustomed to generals eager for glory, grew frustrated. He burned villages, hoping to shame Fabius into action. He desecrated lands sacred to the Romans, expecting outrage to drive their dictator into battle. But Fabius endured the jeers, endured the rage of his own people, and clung to his strategy. In his heart, he knew that every day Hannibal wandered Italy without reinforcements from Carthage was another day Rome inched closer to survival. There was one moment that revealed the true strength of Fabius's will. Hannibal, marching through Campania, found himself trapped in a narrow valley by the Roman army. The people of Rome rejoiced, believing their enemy finally cornered. Yet in the dead of night, Hannibal devised a ruse, driving oxen with burning torches tied to their horns up the hillsides. To Roman sentries, it seemed as if Carthaginian troops were escaping under cover of darkness. Confusion reigned, and Hannibal slipped away with his army intact. The Senate erupted in fury. Critics declared that Fabius had squandered the perfect chance to annihilate Rome's nemesis. His enemies painted him as weak, indecisive, even treasonous. Yet Fabius did not flinch. He knew that had he charged into Hannibal's trap, the Romans might once again have been slaughtered like at Cannae. Better to let the prey escape than to lose everything in a reckless strike. This resolve made him unpopular, but it also revealed the essence of his heroism. Fabius was not a man who sought personal glory. He was a man who bore the burden of his people's scorn for the sake of their survival. In this way, he embodied a different kind of Roman virtue. Not the fire of conquest, but the steel of endurance. Time proved him right. Though mocked as the delayer, Fabius's strategy slowly starved Hannibal of momentum. Carthage sent no great reinforcements. Italian allies, once tempted to defect, grew uncertain as Hannibal failed to deliver the final blow. Rome, though wounded, remained unbroken. And in that endurance lay the seed of future victory. Fabius's shadow loomed long over the next generation of Romans. Among those who watched and learned was a young man named Publius Cornelius Scipio. He saw in Fabius the wisdom of restraint, the power of patience, and the necessity of strategy over pride. Where others mocked, Scipio remembered, and one day he would take those lessons and forge them into a decisive weapon against Hannibal himself. Thus, the hero Rome found in its darkest hour was not the warrior of legend charging headlong into battle, but the patient guardian who kept the Republic alive. Fabius Maximus, mocked as a coward, remembered as the delayer, was the man who showed that sometimes the greatest courage is not in striking, but in waiting. In the end, it was not Hannibal's spear that brought Rome to its knees. It was Rome's own arrogance. And it was not a glorious charge that preserved the Republic, but the steady hand of a man who dared to put survival before pride. Fabius had not defeated Hannibal, but he had denied him victory. And in that denial, Rome began to find its path from tragedy to triumph. The echoes of Cannae reverberated far beyond the battlefield. Rome had faced defeats before, but none so catastrophic, none so intimate. This was not a lost province or a failed campaign on distant soil. This was Italy itself, Rome's own beating heart, torn open and bleeding. The Republic had been humbled, its armies shattered, its pride obliterated. And now, as Hannibal prowled the countryside with an undefeated host, the true danger emerged, not only from Carthage, but from within Rome itself. The Senate was a house divided. In its halls, grief mingled with rage, fear, and desperation. Every bench was marked by absence, by names of senators who lay dead at Cannae. Fathers who once boasted of Rome's destiny now sat in silence, mourning sons who had vanished into the jaws of Hannibal's trap. The weight of loss suffocated debate, yet decisions had to be made. Would Rome surrender, sue for peace, or resist at any cost? Some voices, trembling but firm, urged negotiation. Better to bow before Carthage, they argued, than to watch the Republic consumed. They spoke of survival above all else, of preserving families, property, and the remnants of Rome's greatness. After all, Carthage had triumphed completely in battle. Hannibal was invincible, they said. Why sacrifice more lives to feed his slaughter? Others, burning with fury, demanded vengeance. Raise new legions, they cried. Arm every man, slave or free. Let us hurl ourselves at Hannibal until he is buried beneath the weight of Roman steel. To them, surrender was a fate worse than death. Rome was eternal only so long as its spirit refused to yield. Better annihilation than submission. Between these extremes lay paralysis. The Republic teetered on the edge of collapse, its leaders unable to reconcile pride with fear, vengeance with prudence. And yet, as chaos loomed, one truth became clear. If Rome fractured now, Hannibal's victory would be total. Meanwhile, beyond the walls of the Senate, the streets of Rome pulsed with unrest. Families wept openly, searching for names on grim lists of the fallen. Merchants feared ruin as trade faltered. Farmers fled their lands, scorched and pillaged by Hannibal's raiders. Rumors spread like wildfire. Carthaginian elephants had been seen at the gates. Allies of Rome were abandoning the Republic, even that the gods themselves had turned their backs on the eternal city. Superstition flourished. Priests declared omens of doom. Statues wept blood. Lightning split sacred temples. Strange beasts were seen roaming the countryside. To many Romans, the defeat at Cannae was more than a human failure. It was divine punishment, a sign that Jupiter and Mars had chosen Hannibal as their instrument of wrath. The rituals of appeasement grew desperate. Sacrifices multiplied, and the city's faith trembled on the edge of despair. The crack spread beyond Rome itself. Across Italy, allied states watched with wary eyes. Many had been coerced into Rome's orbit through conquest, their loyalty maintained by fear of Roman power. But now that power lay broken. Cities like Capua, once bound by treaty, began to whisper treachery, wondering whether Hannibal might be the stronger master. In the south, Samnites, Lucanians, and Bruttians weighed their choices carefully. Each defection was a dagger driven into Rome's already bleeding side. The Republic stood at a crossroads. If allies abandoned her, if fear hollowed her Senate, if despair consumed her people, then Rome would not need Hannibal to strike the final blow. She would collapse under her own divisions. And yet, amidst this storm, voices of resilience still rang out. There were senators who declared, "Rome does not surrender. Rome never bows." They reminded their peers that even in her darkest hour, the Republic had endured before. They spoke of the Gallic sack of Rome in 390 BC, when the city itself had been burned, and yet the Romans had rebuilt from ashes stronger than before. They argued that Hannibal had won battles, yes, but Carthage had not yet won the war. This defiance became Rome's fragile lifeline. While many wept, others hardened. Women gave up their gold and jewelry to fund new armies. Boys scarcely of age were drilled for battle, their innocence sacrificed to the Republic's survival. Even slaves were promised freedom if they bore arms for Rome. Out of necessity, Rome became not just a city, but a war machine, remorseless in its resolve to endure. Still, division lingered. Fabius's cautious strategy preserved Rome's strength, but it lacked the glory and decisive victory many craved. His enemies in the Senate, emboldened by impatience, began to undermine him. They demanded boldness, fresh commanders, and the promise of triumph rather than survival. To them, the delayer was a coward, a stain upon Rome's martial spirit. Thus the Republic trembled not only from Hannibal's shadow, but from its own restless soul. The people wanted hope, the Senate demanded certainty, and the generals fought for relevance. In this storm of grief and ambition, Rome was both united and divided, bound by survival, yet torn by pride. Hannibal watched with cunning eyes. He knew that every Roman doubt, every ally's defection, every whisper of surrender was as valuable as a victory in battle. His sword had slain tens of thousands, but now it was Rome's own divisions that threatened to destroy her more completely than any blade. The tragedy of Cannae, then, was not only measured in bodies but in fractures. The Republic stood like a cracked statue, outwardly strong but hollowing from within. Whether it would shatter or endure depended not only on armies and generals, but on the spirit of its people. In that fragile balance, the fate of the ancient world hung suspended. Would Rome be consumed by its fear, or would the Republic find in crisis the iron to hold fast? While Rome reeled from its wounds, Hannibal Barca moved across Italy like a living storm. To his allies in Carthage, he was the greatest general of his age. To the peoples of Italy, he was a liberator, a destroyer, a phantom in the night. And to Rome, he was nothing less than the embodiment of terror. Born into the Barca family, Hannibal had been sworn as a boy to eternal enmity with Rome. His father, Hamilcar, had fought in the First Punic War, watching Carthage humbled and stripped of empire. In the temples of Carthage, young Hannibal placed his hand upon the altar and vowed before the gods never to be Rome's friend. That oath burned within him like a brand, guiding his every step until the day he crossed the Alps. His genius was not merely in tactics, but in audacity. Where other commanders saw obstacles, Hannibal saw opportunity. He led his army, an unlikely host of Africans, Spaniards, Gauls, and Numidians, through the frozen passes of the Alps, a feat so daring it seemed impossible. Snow blinded his men, avalanches buried their path, hostile tribes harassed them from the cliffs, and yet Hannibal pressed on. When they emerged into Italy, scarred but unbroken, he had achieved what no enemy had before. He had brought war into the very heart of Rome's homeland. From the moment he descended, Hannibal struck like lightning. At the Trebia, he crushed a Roman army in ambush. At Lake Trasimene, he orchestrated one of the largest ambushes in history, annihilating another Roman force and sending survivors scrambling in panic. And then, at Cannae, he delivered the masterpiece, encircling, suffocating, and annihilating an army twice the size of his own. Each victory was more than a battle won. It was a message carved into the Roman psyche. Rome was not invincible, yet Hannibal was more than a soldier. He was a master psychologist, a commander who understood that fear was as potent as steel. He moved across Italy with a kind of spectral presence, burning villages, sparing some cities, wooing others into alliance. To the Italian allies of Rome, he offered liberation from Roman chains. To Rome itself, he offered nothing but dread. His very name became a whisper of terror. Hannibal at Portus, Hannibal at the gates. He was everywhere and nowhere. Roman mothers hushed crying children with warnings that Hannibal would come if they disobeyed. Farmers abandoned their fields at the mere rumor of his approach. Even the Senate, proud and unbending, could not silence the fear that he might one day appear before the city's walls, elephants in tow, ready to tear down the eternal city itself. But for all his genius, Hannibal carried a burden. Carthage, proud and wealthy, did not match his audacity with equal support. The Senate of Carthage quarreled, hesitant to send reinforcements across the sea. Hannibal fought not with the full might of his homeland, but with the army he had brought across the Alps, sustained by plunder and the loyalty of allies. He was a predator deep in enemy territory, surrounded by foes, dependent on his cunning to survive. This made his victories all the more terrifying. For over a decade, he roamed Italy unchecked, never defeated in open battle, always a step ahead of his pursuers. He was like a shadow that Rome could not banish, a wound that refused to heal. Even as the Romans adapted under Fabius's strategy of delay, Hannibal remained undefeated, striking where he wished, evading where he must. He seemed eternal, a force of nature rather than a man. And yet Hannibal's greatest weapon was also his greatest limitation: time. Each year he lingered in Italy, Rome learned, adapted, and endured. The Republic refused to collapse no matter how many defeats he inflicted. Allies defected, but not enough to cripple Rome. His army, stretched thin and far from home, could not replace its losses as swiftly as the legions of Rome. Still, his legend grew. To Hannibal's men, he was a leader who shared their hardships, eating what they ate, marching where they marched, inspiring loyalty across cultures and tongues. To the Italian rebels, he was hope incarnate, proof that Rome could bleed. And to the world beyond, he was the specter that shook the greatest power of the Mediterranean to its core. Even the Romans, who cursed his name, could not help but respect his brilliance. Generals studied his maneuvers, knowing that each lesson learned in blood might one day be used against him. The shadow he cast was long, but within that shadow, Rome began to sharpen its resolve. Hannibal had come to Italy to break Rome, to sever her alliances, to shatter her will. And in truth, he came closer than any enemy ever would. For years, he stalked her fields, burned her villages, and slaughtered her armies. He was the nightmare that Rome could never quite wake from. Yet the very fact that Rome endured his fury became its own quiet defiance. For though Hannibal was unmatched in brilliance, his enemy was not merely an army, but an idea, the stubborn, relentless spirit of a republic that refused to die. And so the struggle deepened. Hannibal, the predator circling the wounded beast, and Rome, the prey that refused to collapse. Every year of his campaign was another wound to the Republic, another scar upon her memory. But it was also another year of survival. Another year in which Rome learned that even against the greatest of foes, endurance could outlast genius. For all his victories, Hannibal could not tear Rome apart. And so he remained, year after year, a phantom in Italy, undefeated yet incomplete. A shadow over the Republic, feared, admired, and hated in equal measure. He had brought Rome to the brink of ruin, but whether he could push her over the edge, that remained the question upon which the fate of empires hung. Rome did not rise from the ashes of Cannae in a single stroke. Her revival was not born of sudden victory, but of endurance, forged slowly in the crucible of suffering. And at the heart of this transformation stood two men, separated by age and temperament, yet bound by destiny. The first was Fabius Maximus, the delayer, who taught Rome to survive. The second was Publius Cornelius Scipio, who would one day take those lessons and turn survival into triumph. Fabius's strategy was a bitter medicine. He offered no glory, no decisive battle to avenge the fallen. Instead, he gave Rome time. He shadowed Hannibal, harassing his raiders, burning crops to starve his army, and striking only where the advantage was certain. He was like a wall of shadows, always present, never reckless. To the proud Romans, it felt humiliating. An empire that once commanded the known world reduced to skirmishes and delay. Yet Fabius knew the truth. Rome could not afford another Cannae. Patience was not cowardice. It was survival. Through his leadership, the Republic discovered a new kind of strength. Rome had always believed in speed, in boldness, in the thunder of legions crushing all before them. But now she learned endurance, the art of wearing down an enemy who could not be beaten head-on. Every harvest denied Hannibal, every ally preserved, every soldier saved, was another thread woven into the Republic's future. But Fabius was only the beginning, for as he preserved Rome, a younger generation grew in the shadow of war. Among them was a man who had been only 17 when Cannae consumed his father and uncle, Publius Cornelius Scipio. In the chaos of that battlefield, Scipio had fought his way through the carnage, leading survivors to safety. He had seen with his own eyes the genius of Hannibal, the destruction he wrought, and the despair he left behind. Where others saw hopelessness, Scipio saw lessons. He studied Hannibal, not as a monster to be feared, but as a teacher. He learned the art of mobility, of deception, of psychological warfare. He saw how Hannibal bound together a diverse army with loyalty and respect, but he also saw the Carthaginians' flaws, his isolation from Carthage, his reliance on allies, his inability to deliver the final blow. Scipio absorbed these lessons like a sponge, biding his time, sharpening his mind for the day he would strike back. Rome's endurance under Fabius bought Scipio that time. While Hannibal prowled Italy, Scipio proved himself in Spain, where Rome battled Carthaginian forces for control of Iberia. There he displayed brilliance far beyond his years, swift in movement, daring in attack, yet always mindful of the patience that Fabius had taught. He combined the caution of the delayer with the audacity of Hannibal, forging a new kind of Roman commander, one who could outthink as well as outfight his enemy. As victories in Spain mounted, Scipio's reputation grew. He captured New Carthage in a lightning assault, striking with such speed that the defenders scarcely understood what had happened. He treated conquered peoples with fairness, earning their loyalty where Carthage had ruled through fear. In every success, he revealed the seeds of Rome's rebirth, discipline balanced by daring, patience tempered by boldness. Back in Italy, the Senate watched with cautious hope. Fabius, though aging, continued to urge caution. He warned against recklessness, reminding Rome that Hannibal still stalked their land, undefeated. But even Fabius began to see in Scipio something new, something Rome had not possessed since the disaster of Cannae. A leader who could face Hannibal not merely to survive, but to win. The turning point came when Scipio proposed a daring plan, to carry the war not in Italy, but in Africa itself. By striking at Carthage's homeland, he would force Hannibal to abandon his long campaign and defend his own city. It was a gamble, a rejection of Rome's defensive posture in favor of bold invasion. Some senators balked, fearing another catastrophe, but Scipio's conviction was unshakable. He had studied Hannibal long enough to know that the Carthaginians' greatest strength, his presence in Italy, could be turned into a weakness if he was drawn away. Thus Rome began to shift. Where once she cowered, she now prepared to strike. The armies that Scipio raised were not the raw levies of desperation, but hardened veterans of Spain, men who trusted their commander with absolute loyalty. Their discipline was Roman, their spirit sharpened by suffering, but their tactics bore the mark of Hannibal's own teachings. Scipio had taken the fire of his enemy and forged it into a Roman blade. Even as preparations for Africa took shape, the lessons of Fabius remained at the core of Rome's renewal. The Republic had learned that victory was not seized in a single glorious charge, but built brick by brick, through patience, strategy, and endurance. Scipio did not reject Fabius's wisdom. He built upon it. Where Fabius had delayed, Scipio would strike. Where Fabius preserved, Scipio would conquer. This was the essence of Rome's rebirth, not the denial of her past, but the transformation of her spirit. From the ashes of humiliation, she had forged resilience. From the brilliance of her enemy, she had learned innovation. And from the quiet endurance of Fabius, she had birthed a new generation of commanders who would carry her to victory. By the time Scipio set sail for Africa, Rome was no longer the shattered republic of Cannae. She was reborn, tempered by loss, armed with patience, and led by a man who carried the weight of both tragedy and hope upon his shoulders. The long years of Hannibal's dominance were drawing to a close, not because his genius had waned, but because Rome had finally produced a leader worthy of facing him on equal ground. The delayer had saved Rome from destruction. The Africanus would carry her to triumph. The sun rose over the plains of Zama in 202 BC, and with it, the fate of empires. For nearly 2 decades, Hannibal had haunted Italy like a phantom of vengeance, striking terror into the heart of Rome. Now at last, he stood across from the man destiny had chosen as his rival. Publius Cornelius Scipio, later to be called Africanus. It was no ordinary clash of armies. It was the duel of two worlds. The old Carthaginian genius, tested and scarred by years of war, against the youthful Roman who had studied his every move, who had turned survival into strategy and strategy into hope. The armies were as different as their commanders. Hannibal's host was a patchwork of veterans, Libyans, Carthaginians, mercenaries, and a few surviving Italian exiles. His soldiers were weary but loyal, their spirit bound to their commander, who had led them through fire and blood for more than a decade. Scipio, in contrast, commanded a disciplined, cohesive force. His legions were tempered in Spain, hardened by relentless campaigns, and infused with tactics that bore both Roman steel and Hannibalic cunning. Rome had endured humiliation at Cannae, but from that wound had grown a sharper, stronger sword. The opening of battle came with thunder. Hannibal unleashed his war elephants, a tide of beasts meant to trample Rome into dust. At Cannae, confusion and fear had undone the legions. But Scipio had prepared. He ordered his troops to open corridors, creating channels through which the elephants could charge harmlessly. Trumpets blared, startling the animals, sending many into panic. Some turned back, crashing into Hannibal's own lines. The trap had failed, and the balance of fate began to tilt. Then came the infantry clash. Hannibal's men pressed forward with desperate courage, fighting not just for victory, but for survival. Scipio's legions held firm, shields locking, swords thrusting, the rhythm of Roman discipline steady against the storm. The Carthaginian first line faltered, then the second, but Hannibal had kept his veterans, those who had marched with him across the Alps, who had bled at Tribia, Trasimene, and Cannae, in reserve. When they entered the field, the tide seemed ready to shift. For a moment, Rome trembled. Hannibal's veterans were the finest soldiers of their age, hardened by years at their commander's side. They fought with precision and fury, pushing the Romans back, threatening to break the fragile balance. It was as if the ghost of Cannae had risen again, demanding vengeance. But Scipio had not come to Zama to relive Rome's nightmares. He had come to end them. As the infantry grappled in the center, he unleashed his cavalry. Massinissa, the Numidian prince allied to Rome, led swift horsemen against the Carthaginian riders. In a whirlwind of dust and steel, Hannibal's cavalry was driven from the field, chased far from the battle. When Massinissa and Scipio's horsemen returned, they struck the Carthaginian rear like a hammer. The trap was complete. The Carthaginian veterans, valiant and unbroken, found themselves surrounded. The fate Hannibal had once inflicted upon Rome at Cannae now mirrored against his own army. The legions pressed forward, the cavalry closed in, and the ring of death tightened. What had begun as Hannibal's masterpiece ended as his undoing. In the smoke and cries of Zama, two titans of history faced their reckoning. Hannibal, unbeaten for so long, saw the inevitable. He had fought with brilliance, but brilliance alone could not save an empire that had squandered its chance to support him. Scipio, calm and relentless, pressed the advantage until the Carthaginian line broke. By the day's end, Carthage's army was shattered, its spirit broken. The war was over. Zama was more than a battlefield. It was a resurrection. Rome, humiliated at Cannae, reborn in patience under Fabius, and sharpened by Scipio, now stood supreme. The Republic had stared into the abyss of annihilation and emerged stronger. Carthage, once mistress of the seas, was reduced to a shadow, stripped of empire, forced into submission. Yet even in defeat, Hannibal remained a figure of awe. History would never forget the man who had carried war to the gates of Rome, who had defied the world's greatest empire for so many years. But his legacy was sealed at Zama, not in triumph, but in tragedy, the genius who could not overcome the weight of time and the resilience of his enemy. For Rome, Zama was the final proof of destiny. No disaster, however grave, could break her will. No enemy, however brilliant, could outlast her endurance. From the blood of Cannae to the glory of Zama, the arc of the Second Punic War was the arc of Rome itself, broken, tempered, reborn, and ascendant. In the silence after the clash, Scipio Africanus stood not merely as a general, but as the embodiment of Rome's rebirth. He had taken the lessons of Fabius, the cunning of Hannibal, and the discipline of the legions, and forged from them a victory that would echo through eternity. Hannibal had once been at the gates of Rome. Now Rome stood at the gates of history, unchallenged, unbowed, eternal.